Okay, I think we're live. Just for anybody joining us after the fact, I'm going to just say, hey, welcome to History Chats. We're going to be starting in about 2 or 3 minutes, so feel free to just skip ahead to that rather than the blank screen that will be up for the next 2 minutes or so. For everybody else just joining us, we will be back just a short amount of time to talk about curling. So we'll see you in a bit. All right, I think we're going to get started here. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for another history chats here at the Marathon County Historical Society. Today we're going to be talking about curling. I'm going to hand it over to Gary in a second. Just a little bit about this. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. This will be a quick, about 15 minutes or so discussion. If you have any thoughts, any comments, any questions, just want to say hello, whatever the case might be, please feel free to put that in the chat or the comment section here. We will have some time afterwards, as always, to talk about that if anybody has any thoughts or questions. So I'd encourage you to do that. As I said, today we're going to be talking about curling. I'm going to have, let's see here, Gary join us here. And I will hand it over to here he is.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Welcome, everyone. Today, like Ben said, we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of curling. It has a long history here, of course. And the history of curling really is hundreds of years old. Some views of how people played curling back in the day. It was always on ice. It always had some kind of a broom, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But it has a variety of places in our history, and most of it, and through the years, it has always been a very sport that one can appreciate, especially, of course, in the wintertime, because all of these pictures, one thing that was always essential in all of this was ice. So we'll talk about that. But curling started in Scotland. hundreds of years ago. It was, like I say, a winter sport coming out. And if you know, and if you recognize that Marathon County, Wausau had some Scottish immigrants coming into it, so we can understand a little bit about how Wausau grabbed onto this sport of curling. It sort of came with the people from Scotland into Canada, into the New England parts of the United States, and also, of course, into the Middle West. And since we have some notable Scots here, should talk about that in a few minutes. But again, one of the things that is essential, one of the things that is important in this is it's a winter sport. Always in the early days, pretty much always outside, always a good winter sports that people can really gather around. Some of the things that are necessary for this sport of curling is a broom, also a rock or a stone. It's as you noticed in some of the earlier pictures, a variety of different things were broomed about, but in this day and age, it's pretty much this type of a rock or a stone. And here we are in Wausau in the curling barn, and here they're gathered with their brooms, their rocks, their stones, and ice in an early picture of the curling barn here in Wausau. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. Eventually, that curling barn turned into something quite nice, a little bit more lighter than the dark barn that we showed prior, but it was always the Wausau Curling Club in the curling barns at Marathon Park. But I want to go back a little bit earlier, because this is sort of a mystery that I came across 1886 in the city of Portage newspaper. They were reporting that the Portage Curling Club was getting some curling blocks, which they called them at that time, from a quarry here in Wausau, which was really unusual because I did not know that we were coming out of the granite quarries in this city. Mr. Robertson's, especially Mr. Robertson's granite quarry, that he was in the process of making curling, what they called at that time, curling blocks. We don't know much. Mr. Robertson joined in 1886 with a granite quarry, but if they were aware of granite and the sport of curling then, I'm almost assuming, but we don't have any evidence that there was curling going on here in the 1880s as well as in the 1890s. The people from Scotland were coming here, of course, the Alexanders and the McIndoes and a variety of other people from Scotland were here. So I'm quite confident that they brought the sport of curling with them. That's a little bit of research that we now have to pursue, but in the light of this talk, I think that we can start to date curling in Wausau back into the 1880s, maybe even into the, well, at least into the 1880s and as well as in the 1890s. But the sport of curling really came a little bit later. Again, from the city of Portage newspaper, and then curling will boom here next year. They're reporting on the sport of curling, but an interesting note in this little article was that a personal letter from the editor of the paper, the Wausau Daily Record Herald at that time, John Loomis Sturdivant, was saying that they were organizing a curling club and that they will be with us in our Bonspiel next year. This is dated 1909, coming out of Portage. So again, really early curling going on in this city. Mr. Sturdivant, we're not quite sure of his Scottish background, but he evidently also well known about the sport of curling at that time. And then also in that same year, up here in Wausau, a curling rink was being laid out on Winton Ice Park on Franklin Street. We're not quite sure where that was on Franklin. It was starting to be quite developed. But at least we know that in 1909, curling was starting in full flavor here in Wausau. And it was usually held in conjunction with a winter carnival of some sort. This was 1909, a winter carnival. Later on into the 1920s and 1930s, we're going to, of course, see the winter frolics, a much more organized event in the wintertime celebrating a variety of winter sports. But again, here in 1909, we're seeing that they're going to be doing down at the Rothschilds Pavilion. They're going to flood the park, and they're going to start with curling. So again, a sport that was really unnoticed, in our usual history of the sport in the city. We're now starting to notice that it was coming full force into the early parts of the 1900s. And what I like to do is just show you and tell you a little bit about some of the people that were here that were instrumental, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a few minutes. But Benjamin Wilson, coming from Ontario, again, the sport of curling came heavy duty into Canada. He came to the United States in the age of 17 with his family, came to Wausau in 1907. Again, we're starting to see that early parts of the 1900s, people are starting to gather in Wausau that are going to be bringing the sport of curling into this city. Ben Wilson, a very important part, member of the Wausau group, started in 1910. He started Wilson Mercantile, a large mercantile company lasting here for a long time, a very influential person in this city. And of course, another important person was John Sturdivant, mentioned before in that letter to the Portage Curling Club. He was born in Delavan. He spent many years in the newspaper business, but in 1907, he came here and established the Wausau Daily Record Herald. Again, this era of this early 1900s, people coming into the city that are going to be instrumental in starting the sport of curling in this city. And the other person that I can't lay any specific importance to, besides him being a lumber baron, of course, was Alexander Stewart. But he also was coming from Canada, and he came here much earlier, but he was mid 1800s, I want to say, but he was quite important as a lumber baron in the city. But him coming from Canada, the strong sport of curling up in that region of Canada, I think that he may have had something to do with it, because I think some of his ancestors were from Scotland. So then so then this starts the common story of the Wausau Curling Club, middle of the 1920s, 1925. Again, we see in the headline of the Wausau paper, B.F. Wilson, president of the Wausau Curling Club in 1925. We'll play at the fairgrounds. We'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. But again, this officially marks really the beginning of the Wausau Curling Club in Marathon Park. Again, that same year, first curling game to be held tonight in the stock barns at the fairgrounds in Marathon Park. The beginning, really, of the Wausau Curling Club here in Wausau. And then the next year, again, the schedule, I just mentioned this as, yes, by then, within a year, 60 men and participate in Bonspiels at Rinks and Marathon Park. Again, becoming quite a popular sport already within a year. I think it had its roots way back in the years prior, but it really took off in 1925 as the organization. So here we are in the curling barns at Marathon Park, a dark space, so to speak. But here they were on the ice in Marathon Park, and the curling club, of course, took it upon themselves to brighten up the place a little bit, and it did take a different look, and it eventually did look a little bit brighter instead of those dark curling barn that we saw in the prior slide. So here, then this is pretty much the way the curling barns and the curling club took action through the years in the curling barns at Marathon Park. It was their home for many, many years, almost decades, until the new curling barn, the new curling complex was established off of Kent Street in Wausau. But one of the things that I did want to mention as sort of that put Wausau on the map was United States Men's Curling Association shootout in 1976, where this was the national organization of curling clubs coming into Wausau at the multipurpose building in 1976. It really put Wausau on the map as really a center of curling, really in the United States as well as North America. And this is the organization of that event. Some of the major players of the curling sport getting ready for that title play here in Wausau in 1976. I also want to mention another key player in our curling history was Harry Johnson. Born in 1899 in Stetsonville, graduated Ripon in 1923, came to Wausau that same year to teach at the Wausau High School teaching science. He retired in 1965. But it was Mr. Johnson as really the instrument, the coach of the curling club at the high school that really generated continual year after year interest in the sport of curling in the city. Because when you have these curlers, for instance, in the curling club at high school, Mr. Johnson there on your right, when you have these numbers of curlers coming into the sport, those numbers are going to stay with the sport past the graduation, and they're going to be curlers for the rest of their lives, really, in Wausau as part of the curling club. So it was Mr. Johnson year after year after year that really perpetrated the interest in curling, beginning at the high school, but then keeping it going because these eventually would be curlers being part of the club, like I said, for year after year. A great sportsman in the city. I think one of the key players, if there is a statue of curlers in the city, I think Mr. Johnson should be considered one of those because he certainly had a big part in playing the continuity of curling in this city. Here he is. He not only was the coach of the high school, but he was very involved with the curling club itself. He was a curler himself, a very active person in the curling club through all those years. In 1965, he retired, but then again, it just goes to show that he retired from the sport of from coaching the curling club at the high school. But he what this says is, gives a little bit of a resume of what he did while he was coach, starting the getting it organized within the Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletic Association, and a variety of other things that he did to inspire the sport of curling in this city. So with that, I just wanted to conclude. The sport of curling has come a long way from those outdoor ice rinks, those even as in Wausau, the flooding of the rinks at whether it be Rothschild's Pavilion or on Franklin Street, to the modern, very, very, very modern complex that we have today at the Wausau Curling Center. A sport that in world view is hundreds of years old, but in Wausau's view, maybe going back to the 1880s, 1890s, and a strong early on with the immigrants from Scotland, but then eventually merging and coming through into the current day with great help from the Sturdivants, from the Wilsons and Mr. Johnson to create the sport that we have today in the city of Wausau. With that, I turn it back to Ben, and he'll take any comments or questions that we have. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gary, for that interesting insight. I know it's always a challenge when we, set out to, we should just tell this story, and then we end up, there's a lot of research that goes into, because some of this stuff is not as well known. So very, very well done. As Gary mentioned, if you do have any questions or comments, please do put them in the comment or chat section. Feel free to do that. While we're doing that, give you a moment here to kind of formulate an idea here or all of that. I'm just going to take a moment to thank our sponsors for these events. We are sponsored by the generous contributions to this by Compass Properties and Yankee Bookstore. So big thanks to them for allowing us to do these programs and to help us, not only to our corporate sponsors, but also to all of our members and donors and everything else. This really makes it possible for us to put our time in and look into the early history of curling, which is not something we would normally, probably do. Speaking of this programs, next week, I'm going to come back and I'm going to be talking to you about the history of snowmobile racing and snowmobiles in general, which will be an interesting topic, I think. So we had to come back for that. Again, that'll be, just as always, it'll be 12:30 on Thursdays. And then I don't think we've announced this publicly yet, but the week after, or the month after that in February, we're going to go back to a theme we did last year, people you should know. And so we're going to do more people you should know. So we'll hold off for telling you exactly who we're going to do, but here's the people. So it's up to you. Maybe you can, and any of the history fans out there might be able to pinpoint who we're talking about. Be interested to see if anybody can guess from this. So again, more interesting stuff coming up in the near future for History Chats. And I appreciate you joining us. Let me just take a look here to see if I have any comments. Okay, looks like Stephen Johnson and Cheryl Johnson both thanked Gary for the presentation. Some interesting stuff there. I guess I can throw something out here. Just kind of curious, I guess in your research, it's interesting because winter sports sometimes, like last week we talked about ski jumping, in which it is very much a boys thing. The girls are not encouraged to do this. And you talked about, I mean, obviously the people you talked about tended to be more of the men who brought the sport with them. But obviously curling is one of those sports where you can't say that, oh, it's, there's a physical, men and women are actually kind of treated as sort of comparable in many ways at the highest level. I don't know, is that something you came across when like the schools and things like that? I know that we have, yeah.
The school, of course, and then eventually as the curling club, to that exact, when that exactly happened, I don't know, but of course sure. did become a very important part of curling in Wausau.
Cool. I didn't want me to put you on the spot there, but I thought it's kind of interesting thing there. Anyway, well, it looks like that's it for the questions here. Again, thanks for joining us, and we will be back next week with some mobiles. So hope you join us for that. And in the meantime, have a wonderful week.